The podcast you're about to listen to may contain random lines from musical theater, terrible attempts at regional accents, and a sincere discussion about mental health. You have been warned. Are you ready to start singing with your feet? Formidable. Allez, c'est parti. Non, nous ne sommes pas fous, nous ne sommes pas ivres, nous sommes juste dans la joie. Une joie profonde, nos cœurs elle inonde. Cette joie, elle vient du ciel. Non, nous ne sommes pas fous.
Welcome to Sing With Your Feet, the podcast in which we learn to separate out the important from the urgent. The podcast in which we get extremely practical about the little things that sometimes keep us paralyzed. The podcast in which we learn that lucidity about our bad habits or about our lack of routine is not tantamount to complaining. It is the very discomfort that will help us start making progress. My name is Lily Field.
And I'm Poppy Fields.
And we're going to be your fairy godmothers for the next half hour or so. That's right, my real-life flesh and blood sister, Poppy Fields, is here with us this week too. But don't you worry, Liella Kelly is here also. She took off her death doula hat this week though, and she's going to speak to us from the heart. You'll see, she's got a great big heart. You'll also be hearing a conversation that I recorded with Poppy during a recent visit with the intent of helping me deal with a bit of personal paralysis when it comes to a very specific area of this week's topic, which is habits and routines. Habits and routines. Ugh. They are simultaneously the bane of my existence and the thing that keeps my sanity in check. At either end of the spectrum, they are critically important to my experience of my ideal life. From the perspective of a hyper-creative person, I depend on habits and routines to keep me on the same plane of existence as my more down-to-earth, indulgent husband. Without disciplining myself with habits and routines, I'm not sure if our marriage would have survived the last 23 years. I could if I let myself float from one creative project to another without ever going to bed or coming up for air or sit down to a meal or a shower, for that matter. Add to that the onset of perimenopause, which has the consequence of quite often making me feel like I'm losing my freaking mind. Habits and routines have helped ease some of this discomfort. I talked about this in episode 10 of the podcast, which is entitled La Vie en Rose. Go back and listen. It's kind of funny in a menopause-y kind of way. Habits and routines now form the structure of my days and make it possible for me to live in relative harmony with my indulgent husband and my 2 children. Yes, it requires discipline and determination, and sometimes it really sucks when I have a spurt of creative energy. My creative highs can be very, very high, and my creative lows can be very, very low. But the structure provided by habits and routines, it provides something to return to so that I don't fall so hard after a creative binge. In this way, habits and routines are immensely helpful for my mental health circle on the Venn diagram of my life. With my children, we raise them to depend on routines as well, and this has been extremely helpful when faced particularly with one of our children who is hypersensitive. Habits and routines are immensely helpful in my parenting circle. We're not going to talk about that this week, but I want to plant that seed because we'll be coming back to it another time. Today though, Liella is going to talk about habits as an intrinsic part of taking care of our bodies, which is one of our ideal life themes, which we covered in episode 15 called The One About Our Bodies. I'm going to talk about how habits and routines can help us make better decisions, which, incidentally, is an ideal life theme that we covered in episode 23 that was called You've Got a Choice. And finally, Poppy is going to help me figure out how to turn planning and scheduling into a habit by giving us a primer on planners and calendars. Are you ready? In my ideal life, I'm a person who automates daily decisions as much as possible. I'm a person who doesn't waste time with easy things. I put things back where they belong. I have a habit of planning meals, organizing schedules, and looking ahead. I have a morning routine that brings me joy. I have an evening routine that brings me joy. In my ideal life, I know how to develop a habit and I know how to maintain a good habit. and I am aware of bad habits, and I have the heart and headspace to break them. Now, keep in mind, I don't have all the answers, but because I am naturally impulsive and spontaneous, I've had to deal with this for most of my life. So I've had to create strategies that make me a little bit less of a whiplashy kind of person to live with. As contradictory as it seems, it is because I am spontaneous and impulsive that my ideal life is one that is highly regimented by habits and routines. Anything that can provide touch points throughout the day, it gives me a sense of permanence, which, because I am who I am, I regularly lack. This aspect of my character is one that my husband used to criticize, and although it hurt me at the time, I can now see why it would have driven him crazy. He used to say that I would, air quotes here, separate, which meant that once he was no longer in my sight, I no longer gave him any thought, which was true. I had, and sometimes still do, an object and relationship permanence problem. Because I liked him, and especially I liked how he understood me, I knew I needed to work on this. I am proof that old dogs can learn new tricks if they really, really want to. I hope that I can transmit to you how I learned those new tricks, because I believe that if I can learn to develop habits and routines, then anyone can. You know Lila Kelly because she usually talks to us about death and deathy topics. But this week, she has a really important confession to make, and it has to do with habits. Lila, the floor is all yours.
Before we get started, I need to tell you that your wicked stepsister isn't here today. It's just me, Lila Kelly, fellow podcast listener. And I don't want to talk about death. I want to tell you about my bike. Last September, I bought a used but awesome Pivot Mach 6 mountain bike. I took it to my local bike shop and I had some modifications done. I had the drivetrain switched out, I had new crank arms put on, and I had a dropper post added. Maybe none of that means anything to you, but all of those things made my bike even better. Now, a little background about me. I am 43 years old. I have worked as a massage therapist for 22 years, and I am a death doula, which is 2 caregiving professions. I enjoy being outside, and I have a fairly active lifestyle. So back to my beautiful bike. Last autumn in Montana, it was absolutely gorgeous, and I was mountain biking every chance I got. My friends and I were able to continue all the way into December, and we were riding more and more aggressively. After one of my last rides, as I was loading my bike into the rack on my car, I noticed that there were some twinges kind of deep in my butt muscle. But, whatever, moving on. A couple days later, on our first legitimately cold day of the year, in spite of a little snow, and in spite of me being a bit tired, and in spite of those twinges in my hip, I convinced my friends that we could fit in one last ride. So we did. When I got on my bike, I noticed that I was a little bit stiff, but, I'll warm up. I'll start pedaling. I'll loosen up. At the top of the first climb, I had to stop and take some leave because my leg was just really starting to complain. By the next climb, I could no longer push down on my leg, and I had to get off the bike and push it up the hill. By the time I met back up with my friends, I had wrenched my low back completely, and I was having just massive muscle spasms. I couldn't walk under my own power. I couldn't lift my leg to get it on the bike. So eventually, my friends basically just had to carry me off the mountain. They got me back to my house and back to my husband, and he took over my care. He got me all tucked into bed, and then he went to sleep on the couch so that I could be nice and comfortable. All good. Right up until the time that I needed to use the bathroom. So I couldn't get my husband's attention, so I got out of bed on my own. Somehow, I'm not sure, but I did it. And I made it to the toilet, but I could not, due to the horrible spasms, get myself onto the toilet. Do you know what happened? I stood there and I peed myself. My husband had to clean it up. This was not the most romantic of evenings. And yes, I know that this is way too much information, but I'm sharing anyway. So the next day, I was a little concerned about my condition. So we went to the doctor. They had x-rays done for me and I was fine, except for the massive muscle spasms. So they gave me some heavy-duty muscle relaxers. I missed 4 days of work, but I got to the point where I was functional. I couldn't really hike the way I like to, and I certainly couldn't bend down and touch my toes. In fact, I couldn't really get my own socks on, but I was functional. I remained pretty functional for the next few months. So fast forward to March, and we go on a little vacation, and I went snowboarding. Well, I did something that is not good called catching an edge. This is probably because I couldn't really pick up my back leg the way I should have been able to. And I whiplashed myself because I smacked my head into the ground. I was wearing a helmet, but I whiplashed myself all the same. So my husband and I, we made it over to the chairlift. I got on the chairlift. We went up to the top. And as I had just smacked my head into the ground, when I stood up, I was unstable and I fell over. The lift operator didn't really see this happen, I guess, so he just kept the lift going, and I was run over by the chairlift. The chairlift ripped the back of my brand new snowboarding coat, and it was embarrassing and just unpleasant all around. So we went into the lodge. I got some more Aleve. I bought some stickers so that I could temporarily mend the back of my coat, and decided I could still snowboard the rest of the day. After all, I did not want to waste my $80 lift ticket. Ever since then, my neck has been stiff, I don't have full range of motion, and my fingers keep going numb. But I'm functional, so all is well, right? Well, as spring arrived, I decided I was going to be back to mountain biking and running. Well, running was really hurting my hip. Probably because my back had never really gotten back into alignment. So naturally, as we do, I was complaining to my friend. I was telling her all my woes. And do you know what she said to me? She said that I had to come clean about my bad habits, that I have a complete lack of self-care, and I need to recognize that. So that is what I'm here doing. It's me admitting my total disregard for self-care. Such a bad habit. She also recommended I go to a chiropractor and another therapist. So in the last couple months, that is what I have been doing. And guess what? I am not feeling old and creaky and stiff and in constant pain. My hip and back don't hurt, and I can bend over and pick things up off the floor without doing some weird contortion and bracing posture. And my fingers, I feel them. So I am creating new habits and I am feeling way better. It turns out a good habit of self-care goes a really long way.
I know for a fact that I needed to hear that. Thank you, Layla, for reminding us that it is not selfish to care for ourselves. Our bodies tell us things, and when we don't make it a habit of listening to it, we can end up with a lot of discomfort. I'll put a link to Layla's death doula work in the show notes. As she always says, talking about death won't kill you. Go take a look at what she's up to. Incidentally, I have noticed that people with big hearts, people who care for others, generally don't take very good care of themselves. As people who love those people, we can try to provide occasions to help them do this. Offering to watch their kids while they go to the doctor, for example, or taking them a meal so they don't have to cook. Remember the golden rule. We should do for others what we would want done for us. So if we would dream of someone carving out a moment for us to practice self-care, then maybe we can start by creating an opportunity for someone we love to have some time for self-care. It's no guarantee that someone will ever do it for us, but at least somebody is getting a moment to breathe. As a creative person, I feel a kind of moral imperative to constantly be reinventing the wheel. I cannot be satisfied by simply reading about something. I have to get my hands dirty and try it for myself so that I understand how something works. This is true for work, for organizing events, for crafts, and for just about anything I undertake. The problem is this. As I've told you before, I'm an enthusiast. Anything that scratches the creative itch in the back of my head can quickly become an obsession. I could, at any given time in my life before I understood the value that habits and routines brought to my marriage, I could disappear mentally and emotionally from my relationships while I pursued my creative urges and impulses. The project mentality that creativity fosters is not easily compatible with the maintenance mentality that relationships, parenting, and marriages require. And I made a lot of bad decisions. One day, in the middle of my midlife crisis, I realized that I had checked out of my marriage, probably because it required a maintenance mentality. And I had been heretofore unwilling to acquire that maintenance mentality. I was overwhelmed by everything that I needed to get done. And with 2 small children in tow, I often felt like I was going to lose my mind. While this may not on the surface seem entirely related, I think that the fact that I was trying to live in a project mentality with things that required a maintenance mentality, it made me particularly susceptible to urges and impulses. The question for me was how to get out of this go-with-the-flow mentality required for a project and into a less easily distracted mind frame. So, as part of my Buy No Clothes in 2021 challenge, which I told you about last week, I also undertook to understand where the urges and the impulses came from. I wanted to understand what made me want the things that I couldn't have. And I wanted to learn how to turn away from those urges and those impulses. One of the very first things I did was to intentionally stop fearing my desires. You see, this was always one of the stepping stones to giving into an impulse. I would try to deny myself a little pleasure, which always made it more desirable. Saying no only made something more forbidden, and forbidden fruit is always more delicious. What I did instead was I started being curious about my desires, asking myself questions about the object of that moment's desire. What did I like about it? What would I do with it? Where would I put it? By turning curiosity and a little bit of self-interrogation into a habit, not trying to shut off the valve of the impulse right away by saying no, I usually could diffuse the impulse. It was far more satisfying, and when done over time, often multiple times per day, it became easier to do. This whole topic of learning about how to be curious is one that we're going to talk about in the next season, but the benefit is so life-altering that I wanted to mention it here. For example, as part of my challenge, I started the year by noticing, literally counting how many impulsive, covetous thoughts I would have in one day. At the beginning, it was in the 20s per day. I would see someone's shoes and I would wonder where I could get the same ones. I would see a piece of jewelry and think, ooh, I need that. I would see someone's cute face mask and I would get mask envy. Seriously, it was like a sickness. By the time I had built up the habit of being curious about the things I was coveting, I was rarely, if ever, experiencing that kind of intense wanting anymore. This habit literally helped change the core of my character. Old dog, new tricks. It's possible. Another extremely important element to reducing the number of impulsive or urge-driven decisions, it was automating the easy things. We talked about decision fatigue, which we defined as the difficulty we have at resisting temptation when we've been making many unimportant, insignificant, but urgent decisions. The prime example of this is at the grocery store, when for 30 minutes we've been filling our cart with items that we've chosen for their utility, yes, but also for the price or the size of the package or for some other reason. Our decision-making faculties get worn out under the stress of knowing that we need to get everything on our list, and we end up unable to resist, that family-sized tub of mint chocolate chip ice cream that's on sale, or the Snickers bar at the checkout counter. Like Layla said last week, we are faced daily with tons of decisions that are unimportant and relatively insignificant, especially if we make them when they are not urgent. Urgent decisions use up more emotional energy and they take up more space in our hearts and minds. A decision like, what am I going to wear? It isn't urgent or terribly important for that matter until you realize that you have only 3 minutes before you have to leave and you are still in your pajamas. This decision about what you're going to wear can be made at another time, thus freeing up that space in your heart to avoid an urgent, fatigue-creating decision. Building a habit can be partly defined as automating easy, insignificant, non-urgent decisions. A decision like what is for dinner on any given day is important, but it doesn't have to be urgent. And listen, I'm preaching to myself here, friends. Preaching to myself. It doesn't have to be made 5 minutes before everyone starts getting crabby from hunger. Making it earlier, either early in the day or even ideally earlier in the week, it means that there is that much more heart and head space for the more important things, like connecting with and spending quality time with those potentially crabby people that we love so much. Now, don't start thinking that I have this all figured out. I have been able to concretely make progress with certain things, like having a designated home for everything I own, for example, so that I don't have to make decisions about where things go when it's time to clean up. This habit of designating a home for things is one of the biggest sanity savers when it comes to my hormonally driven fog. Having a routine of taking a few minutes several times a day to put things in their designated homes, it's likewise been a sanity saver. It's not all la vie en rose, but it's definitely a step forward.
Elle me fait bondir et vibrer, crier. Elle me donne envie de chanter, danser. Elle pousse à agir, donner, partager. Et tout simplement de sourire aimer.
In episode 17, I shared with you that although I had enjoyed and succeeded in a career as a wedding planner, somehow, when faced with my own family and my own marriage, I found myself failing miserably in anything that looked remotely like planning ahead. This was, and still is, an uncomfortable sticking point in my family. My real-life flesh and blood sister, who is also a life coach, Poppy Fields, she came to France for a visit recently, and I asked her to give me a primer on planners and calendars so that I can get unstuck. Hopefully, making a planning habit that I want to stick to going forward. Here's a little bit of that conversation. Would you recommend a virtual planner or a hard copy planner?
This is a very, very personal choice. I personally would love to get on board with the virtual planner. It's so much easier to carry around because my iPad is literally one of my appendages. So I wish I could just incorporate my planner into the iPad that I'm already going to be carrying around. I've tried it. It doesn't work for me personally. Partly call it my age group. Partly call it, I love the actual satisfaction of writing things down and crossing them off on a piece of paper. It's very satisfying.
You had said something really interesting talking about the age group thing, textbooks and why you find virtual textbooks so difficult to use. Could you tell us about that?
Aging myself and Lily here just a smidge. I am 48 years old. We grew up in a time there were not computers. I mean, they existed, right? But they certainly weren't laptops or anything of the personal nature. So when we grew up, we had textbooks. You had to lug your 6 or 7 subjects in your backpack on your back to class every day. That's what you did. So when you studied, you opened a textbook that could be 300 to 400 pages long, and you remember things like, oh, I need to find out, what about molecules? Where was that in my textbook? Oh, I remember there was a picture, or I had highlighted something nearby, and you could flip through it really quickly. You find your picture, you find the topic, there you go. The problem with virtual e-readers is you can't just flip through the book anymore to find that picture or that highlighted spot or where you had taken a note. I have no idea how children learn now. It completely boggles my mind. I love to read a novel on my Kindle. I love to be able to just, get something from the library, download to my iPad. It's super cool. But actually learning is another thing entirely. And so for me, it's the same thing with a planner. I will say, because I'm, again, my age and I don't love all the tech stuff, I will literally have written down a password somewhere in my planner. And I'm like, okay, what was that password again? I know it was in February. And then I can go back to February and I'll where is it there? Oh, yeah, there it is. Okay. This is why I love paper planners.
But you've tried different virtual planners,
yes.
right?
Lily had suggested Day One, which is a fabulous option. I have tried something called Zinnia, which you can create your own planner, but it winds up being more like a scrapbook. I spent so much time setting things up. You had to use a stylus in order to cross things off or check things off, and it was super unsatisfying when you would go in there, check off something, and you just go, Choom. It doesn't have the same feel as paper when you're crossing something off your list of things that you've done.
And when you cross something off, it's such a feeling of satisfaction, and that is another moment of joy.
Yes. And you don't have that moment of joy because you just well, okay, I guess I did. Zinnia stores locally on your device, so you have to be very mindful of the storage capacity. It took up a lot of space on my tablet. Zinnia has a free version in which it works exactly the same. You can only have 3 separate, they call them books, and I was using them for different months. You could only plan ahead for 3 months at a time, and then you have to delete it. Well, then what's the point of your planner, right? It just didn't work for me. I have tried literally every other planner on the planet that was in English. I have many years I had a Daytimer. You can order from Daytimer. They are brilliant people. They have so many different versions. They have dated, undated. You can get any number of sizes. I personally love a humongous planner. I like to write big. Other people like to be able to just throw it in a little purse. So they have tiny little planners too. Naturally, those are going to limit what you can put on the planner. They have 2 pages per day, they have 1 page per day, but the Daytimer is limited to a quarter. So if you have a daily planner, you will get January through March, April through June, etc. I feel like you almost need 4 or 5 months at a time. Only going to work super well for the first month of the quarter, otherwise you're just going to have to carry around 2. So that's one of my drawbacks with Daytimer. It was also a little expensive, but you're only paying for it once because you'll get the whole year in advance. It's not a horrible price for what you're getting because they really give you a nice product. So when I started creating my planner, I would have a few pages at the beginning for random things like, certain goals I have for myself. I have weekly step goals, and I put that kind of at the front. If you might have other types of habits and routines you're trying to accomplish, it might have to do with the gym, it might have to do with studying, it might have to do with, whatever is important to you, but you have your own thing. So anyway, I have that at the beginning, and then I have a monthly calendar, and then I start with a weekly, I actually do have a monthly to-do list. Birthdays go at the top. It's very important. Birthdays are incredibly important, so you gotta have those. And then, your things that your goals, and then anything you're trying to do that month. It might be, don't forget to get your oil changed, or, hey, I have a new experience I want to have this month. I have a weekly page. I'll put what's happening that day, and these are things where I have to be there. I have to show up, whether it's virtually or in person. It might be meetings. It might be, I have a lot of dog walking I do. It might be personal appointments, that type of thing. Then on the bottom 2/3 is when you get into things that are very personal, and it's really only going to relate to you, right? One is where I put my steps. Actually, it's really 4 columns. I have my step goal for the day. I have my ideal life exercise topic. The 3rd column is specifically about mise en place. Lily has waxed lyrically over. I am an enormous fan of mise en place. Lily does that every night before she goes to bed. I do it on a weekly basis. I generally know what's coming up, which days I might have virtual meetings. If I know I'm only going to be out walking some dogs that day, well, I want to wear something that doesn't matter if it gets furry. Living in the Pacific Northwest, you need to know if it's going to be raining. Is it? Yes, it will be. I promise it will rain at some point during the day. That's my 3rd column is mise en place. Fourth column is meals. So you can make something that will even last for 3 days. That is even better. Like, I know I'm going to have to do this and this and this. So Wednesday night, I don't want to have to be cooking. So let's plan ahead so that, I will already have made something. Those are my personal columns for each day of that week. And it could be different for everyone on what's important to you. To facilitate writing out the schedule on a daily basis, I would also print out a little actual, it's not even a calendar, it's like an hourly schedule. If it's kind of an easy overview of what's happening that day.
I have found this method really, really helpful, the one with your columns and then your blocks. And I'm going to put a link to it in the show notes so that people can see what you're talking about, because it really, really has been helpful to me. Thank you so much for sharing all of these ideas with us. I really, really appreciate it, and you've given me tons of food for thought for setting up that planner that will help me track my habits and routines too.
Well, I am so happy to have been here in person with you.
We'll talk soon. Let's take a minute to review the 4 questions that we ask for each of our Ideal Life categories on the theme of habits and routines. What is working? What good habits do you currently have? What routines are working for you and making your life easier? Have you noticed any progress? These are things to celebrate. Here's an example of something I'm really excited about. My indulgent husband decided to set himself a challenge of cleaning the toilet every single morning for 3 weeks. It's now been way more than 3 weeks, and he's still at it every single day. I love having a front row seat to someone else's success in habit forming. What isn't working? What are the rocks in your shoes these days? For me, it's the fact that I simply hate planning meals, and I would rather die than think about it. With summer coming up and everyone being home all the time, I am going to need to get really serious about this. Things to consider. I want to get serious about a planner, like the one Poppy suggested, and I want to get into the habit of actually using it, even if it's just for the summer. I want to give it a try. Maybe this will help me build a good meal planning habit. And if I can make progress in this, then I'm going to have to buckle down and get disciplined, and I'm going to need to take inspiration from my indulgent husband to make this happen. Hey, at least I don't have to get elbow deep in the toilets. Things to do. I need to print out Poppy's weekly planner pages, one for each week of the summer. And then I want to make a list of summer goals and start planning how to attain them. Figure out which ones of them are habits that I just need to get started. There are a million great resources out there about developing habits, and I hope you can take the time to find the ones that will really speak to you. I'll put a link to one of my favorite ones in the show notes. Her name is Gretchen Rubin. She's an author, and she has written a lot of really great books about habits and routines. Part of the satisfaction of a life well lived is having been faithful in the little things. The little things can look like those tiny little daily habits and routines that keep your family functioning smoothly and help keep you healthy. What I want you to walk away with from this episode is that even highly creative people can benefit from developing habits and routines. This may sound counterintuitive, but I've found it to be one saving grace in the midst of the ebbs and flows of creativity. Habits and routines give structure to fall back on when excitement fades. This structure can keep us out of the pit of despair that can accompany an ebb of creativity. Keep an open mind about these things, my creative friends. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on your podcatcher, and please, if you enjoy something that you've heard here, share it with someone you think could use a fairy godmother too. A great big thank you to 7 Productions here in Mulhouse, France for the use of the song La Joie as the intro and outro to the show, and also thanks to Matt Kugler who sang it and Claude Equi who wrote it. This is your fairy godmother signing off. Just remember, it's never too late to start singing with your feet.